What's going on YouTube? Metal Complex here, and today I'm going to be going over some different means of deployment, or the proper means of deployment for a single-handed manual opening folding knife. And the reason I want to do this is because I've noticed, over time, that when I go to hand off a manual opening thumb stud folding knife, people seem to kind of struggle around it a little bit. And, it's because people are used to your slip joint style two-handed opening folding knives or your assisted folding knives. There's a spring in there. You really don't need to know any special trick to opening your folding knife. You simply pull the lever or push the thumb stud and the torsion bar takes care of it. That's why I have these three over here on the mat. By the way, the mat's here to get rid of the glare from the table. I've noticed that in previous videos. So, Victorinox Cadet slip joint style, your Kershaw Blur assisted opening, and this is a budget Kershaw 1336WM. Knives like that are generally what people are used to. Those kind of have saturated the budget market. Not so much the Blur, but the assisted opening knives and the slip joint style knives have saturated the budget market, and that's kind of what people are used to. Now, as you go up in price, a lot of times what you're going to see are more non-spring assisted folding knives with different means of one-hand deployment. And the reason that it might be good to, maybe you're expanding your collection, maybe you're looking to get into a higher end folding knife, for whatever reason, I think it's a good idea to know exactly how to deploy knives like these, because it's quite a bit different than an assisted folding knife. And another reason I'm going to do this is I want to point out that especially in the less expensive assisted opening knives, the torsion bar that's responsible for firing the blade out can break. And, maybe it'll last a decade or two and not break if you have maybe a more expensive one. But it also could break in a month. And then you're left with a manual opening folding knife. In the case of these Kershaws, that's still okay because they have a detent that will still hold the blade in place. But you've got a non-assisted blade, and if you're not used to creating your own energy buildup to deploy the knife, then that might be an issue. And if you are like me and you find yourself in situations where maybe you're holding something up, or your non-knife hand is busy, then getting the knife out of your pocket and deploying it with one hand is incredibly convenient versus having to fumble around and get this all the way, So I wanted to kind of go over that. And I know that there are going to be people subscribed to this channel who already, have a good understanding of that. But I have a feeling there's a fair amount of people out there who have watched videos of people, just sort of casually opening folding knives, and then they go to try it themselves on a manually opening folder and just can't get it. So I'm gonna talk about some different things that you might see and exactly how to interact with them with your fingers to get them to deploy properly. Your most standard system that you're going to see is a single thumb stud. So this is a small one. This is that Camillus titanium I picked up at that pawn shop, but it's got a great action. And something to consider is how smooth, your action is. If it seems to have excess resistance, or there's a grindy sound in there, then that's going to actually further hinder you from being able to deploy the knife properly. But if the action is smooth from the get-go, it should be pretty easy. The next thing to consider is the relationship between the position of the thumb stud and the pivot. Generally, the closer it is, the easier it's going to be to deploy. Not always. But the third thing to consider, or the next thing to consider in relation to that, is how easy it is to get your finger into the cutout provided on the scale. Now in this case, this is a light knife with good action, and the thumb stud's pretty close to the pivot, and it doesn't have the best cutout, but when you place your finger underneath that pivot there, let me see if I can focus here. You want to get right underneath there. A lot of people put their fingernail under here. You can do that, but I find it easier to brace the skin of my thumb underneath it. And it seems like you would want to push this way. But what you're actually wanting to do is push up or build energy this way. So as you do that, you build up, that detent is going to release at some point once there's enough pressure, and the thumb stud will actually swing around this way, but the energy that you've applied here will force the knife into the locking position. You should not have to whip the knife open. You should be able to do this with no wrist action whatsoever if you've done it properly. Another example, the Ontario Rat 1. This is a much larger knife with a heavier detent. It's a longer space between the pivot and the pivot and the thumb stud, and there's a larger cutout, but this is a much larger, heavier blade. Again, find a position for your thumb up under the thumb stud, push up, straight up, and the knife should deploy. Now, you know, when you start doing this, you're going to be pushing up and kind of thinking about it, and then trying to, you know, translate that into deployment. But you'll get to a point where you can simply place your finger down and deploy it. It'll be muscle memory. It won't be something that you have to sit and think about. It's a lot like diving off the diving board for the first time when you're a kid. It's kind of, you're not really sure exactly how to get your body into position to go head first into the water, but once you do it, you remember how to do it forever. You don't even have to think about it. So, again, thumb under the thumb stud. You're going to want to push this way, but if you push this way, you can't build up enough energy before the detent releases. You push up, you can build up an enormous amount of force before the position of the thumb stud and the relation to the pivot force the blade to open this way, and that energy carries the blade into the locking position. This actually has a pretty grindy pivot because I've been using it for things that knives shouldn't be used for. But that's the glory of the Rat 1. You can do that because of the price on it. So the pivot was pretty grindy, but because of the amount of force that I can apply to it before it deploys, it'll still deploy. The Benchmade Reptilian, this is one of my favorite thumb stud opening knives. It has an incredibly smooth pivot because I've polished the washers on it, and an amazing cutout here. The thumb stud is fairly close to the pivot, but let's just take a sec to appreciate what I just did there. I just talked this thing up and talked about how smooth it was, and I just polished the washers. I'm trying to do a video on proper thumb stud deployment, and then I just failed miserably. So take this opportunity to laugh at me real quick. I definitely would if I was watching this video. Anyways, let's try that again. Sometimes, I'm going to try and justify that. Sometimes going from one knife to the next, you forget the point of pressure, or you lose the point of pressure that you're expecting, and you end up pushing it in the wrong direction. So I pushed it a little bit too much this way. But because the position of the thumb stud in relation to the pivot is a little further out, you have to adjust. So for this knife, up is here. There we go. Epic fail. I am going to post the video with that fail. I am not going to try and cover that up. Anyways, I mean, it is a good example there. You know, going from knife to knife, you're going to run into that. If you've got room to get your thumb under there, and you've got, you know, a brace point, where in this case I'm using my palm, where you can apply pressure and then brace the other end against your palm, the knife should deploy with ease. It should. Next type of mechanism, we have the ZT0562, which this isn't really fair to use because this is one of the best flippers of all time. You really don't even have to know how to do this to get this thing to fire because it's on bearings and the detent is very heavy. But the idea with this, and you know, for those of you who aren't familiar with this knife, no, there's no spring in here. I'm going to light deploy it so I can show. There's no spring in this whatsoever. It is just riding on bearings, and the detent, which is this right here, right there, that's holding the blade in. So you're trying to apply pressure enough to get the detent to break, but still have enough energy built up to deploy the blade. Now, a lot of times if you light switch it, which means just pulling down like this, it's not going to want to deploy. The idea here, and this is a cause of a lot of argument online, is you actually want to be pushing in a little bit first to build up energy and then down. So in, down. Do it again. In, you can see the position of my thumb here, moves to here, moves to here. And it's hard to explain on camera, but if you have the opportunity to do that, then you'll know what I mean. Now, again, you might have a flipper where you're like, I'm trying this while you're showing the video and it's not working. Well, some flippers don't have a heavy enough detent. If the detent is too light and the blade wants to break free just with the lightest push, then it's going to be much harder. You really have to build up some energy to do that. If you have to do this, it's not a flipper. And you're doing it incorrectly, especially if it's a ZT. You should never have to whip that blade out on a ZT. If the detent is correct, there's bearings in it, or even if there's not bearings in it, it should always look like that. You can watch my wrist. No, you shouldn't have any wrist action whatsoever. It should just deploy. Next mechanism you might see, I'm going to relate this more to the thumb disc style opener, but it's just kind of a piece of metal that's sitting on top of the blade, and you see that every now and then. This is also a frame lock. So I should have covered that in the ZT. When you're flipping these, a lot of people are like, I'm trying to flip it, and it's not flipping. Well, it's because you're putting your fingers on that lock bar. And as you do that, that lock bar is putting excess pressure on the blade, and that detent ball is digging into that detent hole in the blade, and it's making it harder to deploy. So when you do that, you have to keep your fingers off the frame lock. I like to just rest them on the pocket clip because the pocket clip's resting on the left side of the frame, which doesn't interact with the blade, and it'll deploy. Same thing here, except we've got a small frame lock with a, whatever you want to call it. So we're going to call it a thumb disc for the sake of just progressing with the video. So again, keep your fingers off the frame. I like to dig my fingernail up underneath the notch there because this particular one is a little small. If you've got a thumb disc, you might be able to use the skin on your thumb, but I'm going to use my fingernail here to deploy the blade. It's the same process. You're building up pressure underneath here. Another bad example. And you're deploying the blade. Now, what's also possible sometimes with this type of mechanism is getting your fingernail up underneath that stud on the other side. You can see how I've got it there. Bracing the knife against your palm here and doing the reverse flick. That's going to be a little bit difficult. You're going to have to practice that because if you're not used to that or you haven't built up some muscle memory in that finger, your hand's not going to want to do that. But it's the exact same idea. Build up some pressure and then let the blade release, break its own detent, it should fire into position. The easiest knives to deploy, in my opinion, are the Spyderco line of knives, specifically the Mannix 2 or the Paramilitary 2, because that thumb hole allows for, I'm going to show you here, you can use the skin of your thumb to deploy the knife. You can get your fingernail in there to deploy the knife. Or you can do my personal favorite with these. It's the easiest. Again, brace against your palm, thumb here off the blade, and fire it with your finger in reverse. Show that up close what I'm doing here. Sticking your fingernail in that hole, bracing the knife against your palm, thumb here, and deploy. That's essentially the idea there. Now that is also possible with some very smooth opening thumb stud openers. So position the knife where you feel you've got it firmly planted, brace with your thumb, and then fire with your reverse finger. You're getting your fingernail underneath that stud there. And that's essentially how that works. That one's a little bit harder to do, but again, once you do it once, you're going to kind of have a general idea. Now, if you have a knife with a much heavier detent and there's not enough space for your finger, then you're not going to be able to get your thumb underneath there. You're not going to be able to build a good brace point. And even if you do, the detent might be so heavy that the knife just doesn't allow you to do it. I'm trying as hard as I can there. I can't do it. Even digging my finger, that actually hurts. So a knife like this, you may not be able to do it. It may just be strictly a regular deploying knife. That's essentially, everything there. You're going to have some situations like the ZT where it looks like there's a thumb stud here, but it's actually not. It's just a lug that's meant to brace against the frame. So that's, that might throw some people off. But in the ZT's case, it's really strictly just a flipper. But ultimately, I hope this helped some people kind of understand the idea behind a manually deploying knife. And these are almost strictly what I carry is a manually deploying knife because, number one, really, the all-encompassing factor here is that there's no extra torsion bar inside the knife to fail. I'm not relying on the torsion bar to do the job. And at the same time, it's still a knife that I can pull out of my pocket with one hand, deploy with one hand, use, disengage, and put away all with one hand. I don't have to worry about anything else. I just need a free hand to pull the knife out and use it. I don't have to worry about anything breaking, anything like that. So the simple construction, the less parts is better idea is kind of what I'm getting at here. There's certainly nothing wrong with your slip joint style knives, your Victorinox Cadet, or your assisted opening knives. But there are situations where if I've got one hand busy and I need a folding knife and I've got this in my pocket, it's going to be really difficult. I literally have to catch that against my pocket and pull it open like this and try not to cut my finger in order to get that to work, So, and in the event that this breaks, the torsion bar, after I'm pulling it out and using it, well, like I said, the blade will still function, but if you're not used to deploying it without a torsion bar or a spring in there, I'm going to guess the detent's going to be super light, and you're going to end up, if you're using the flipper tab on something like this, you're going to end up whipping it, which is going to cause unnecessary wear on the stop pin back here, and ultimately it will translate to your lock bar, locking up further and further and further until you have lock rock. So to avoid unnecessary wear like that, if your torsion bar breaks on any type of knife, I would obviously, prefer people practice with a manual thumb stud so that you deploy the knife with the proper amount of force and not so much that you're causing excess wear. That is pretty much it today, guys. I hope you found this video entertaining. If you did, please leave a like. And if you'd like to check out my other content, I do have lots of either expensive or inexpensive knives that I do or don't like. So check that content out. And if you enjoy all of that, then subscribe to my channel and turn those notifications on because there's definitely more to come. Thanks again and have a great day.